The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Appalachian Heritage Museum in Asheville, casting long shadows across rows of carefully preserved photographs that lined the exhibition hall. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent the better part of 15 years as the museum's chief curator, dedicating her life to preserving the stories of mountain families who had carved out existences in the rugged terrain of western North Carolina during the late 19th century. Her days followed a comfortable rhythm of cataloging donations, researching provenance, and occasionally giving tours to school children who shuffled through the galleries with varying degrees of interest. She took pride in her work, believing that every faded photograph and weathered document represented a thread in the larger tapestry of American history, a connection to people whose struggles and triumphs deserved to be remembered. The museum itself occupied a restored Victorian building that had once served as a boarding house for travelers making their way through the mountains, and Sarah often felt the weight of all those accumulated stories pressing gently against her consciousness as she moved through its familiar corridors. On this particular Tuesday in late September, Sarah was preparing for the museum's annual autumn exhibition, a showcase of newly acquired materials that had been donated or purchased over the previous year. Among the recent additions was a collection of photographs that had come from the estate of a woman named Margaret Holloway, whose family had lived in the remote Pisgah Forest region for generations. The collection had arrived in 3 cardboard boxes, each filled with loose photographs, tintypes and daguerreotypes that spanned nearly a century of family history. Sarah had been working through the materials methodically, creating detailed inventory records and researching the individuals who appeared in the images. Most of the photographs were typical of the era, showing stern-faced farmers standing beside their cabins, women in simple dresses holding babies, and children posed stiffly in their Sunday clothes. The images told familiar stories of hardship and resilience, of families who had wrested livings from unforgiving land and maintained their dignity despite poverty and isolation. As Sarah carefully removed each photograph from its protective sleeve and examined it under the bright LED lamp on her desk, she found herself drawn into the lives captured in those frozen moments. There was something deeply moving about seeing the faces of people who had lived more than a century ago, people who had experienced joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment, love and loss, just as she did in her own life. She wondered about their dreams and fears, about the conversations they had shared around dinner tables and the secrets they had kept from one another. The work required patience and attention to detail, skills that Sarah had honed over years of practice, and she took satisfaction in the slow, methodical process of bringing order to chaos, of transforming a jumbled collection of images into a coherent narrative that visitors could understand and appreciate. Each photograph received a catalog number, a condition, assessment, and preliminary notes about its content and historical context. It was late in the afternoon when Sarah reached the bottom of the second box and pulled out a large format photograph that immediately caught her attention. The image showed a family of 7 people arranged in front of a simple wooden cabin, the kind of dwelling that had been common throughout the Appalachian region during the 1890s. The photograph was in remarkably good condition, considering its age, with sharp details and good contrast that allowed Sarah to see the individual faces clearly. The family consisted of what appeared to be a father and mother in their 40s, 3 teenage children, and 2 younger boys who looked to be around 8 or 10 years old. They were dressed in their best clothes, the men in dark suits with high collars, the women in long dresses with their hair pulled back severely from their faces. Their expressions were solemn, as was typical for photographs of that era, when long exposure times made smiling impractical. But there was something else in their faces as well, a quality that Sarah could not quite identify, but that made her pause and look more closely at the image. The cabin behind the family was constructed of rough-hewn logs, with mud chinking visible between the timbers, and a stone chimney rose along one side of the structure. A simple wooden door stood open behind the family, revealing darkness within, and above that door, hanging from what appeared to be a nail or hook driven into the log wall, was an object that Sarah initially dismissed as a farming tool or perhaps a decorative item. But as she leaned closer to the photograph, adjusting the angle of her lamp to eliminate glare from the surface, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The object was not a tool at all, and its presence above the doorway seemed suddenly ominous in a way that transformed the entire character of the photograph. Sarah reached for her magnifying glass, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned it over that section of the image, and what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat and her professional detachment evaporate in an instant. Sarah sat back in her chair, the magnifying glass still clutched in her hand, and stared at the photograph with a mixture of fascination and horror. What hung above the door was unmistakably a noose, the rope coiled in the distinctive 13-loop configuration that had been used for hangings throughout American history. The rope appeared old and weathered, suggesting it had hung there for some time, and its placement directly above the family's doorway seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Sarah's mind raced with questions as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Why would a family choose to display such an object in their home? And more puzzling still, why would they include it in a formal family portrait that was meant to commemorate and celebrate their unity? The presence of the noose transformed the photograph from a simple historical document into something far more complex and disturbing, a window into aspects of mountain life that were rarely discussed in polite historical narratives. She turned the photograph over carefully, hoping to find some notation or identification that might provide context, and discovered a faded inscription written in pencil on the back. The handwriting was difficult to decipher. The letters formed in the elaborate cursive style common to the late 19th century, but Sarah had years of experience reading such scripts, and she worked through it slowly. The inscription read, "The Garrett Family, Pisgah Forest, North Carolina, September 1891, followed by a list of names that presumably identified the individuals in the photograph. Sarah copied the names into her notebook. Thomas Garrett, age 47, father; Elizabeth Garrett, age 44, mother; James Garrett, age 19, Mary Garrett, age 17, Samuel Garrett, age 15, Robert Garrett, age 10, William Garrett, age 8. Below these names, in what appeared to be different handwriting, perhaps added at a later date, were the words, "Before the trouble came." The phrase sent another chill through Sarah's body, suggesting that whatever the noose represented, it was connected to some significant event in the family's history. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon searching through the other materials in the Holloway collection, looking for any additional photographs or documents that might shed light on the Garrett family and their mysterious portrait. She found several other images that appeared to show the same cabin from different angles, and a few photographs of individual family members, but nothing that explained the presence of the noose or clarified what the inscription meant by trouble. As the museum's closing time approached, Sarah carefully scanned the photograph at high resolution, creating a digital file that would allow her to examine every detail more closely, and then secured the original in an archival storage box. She locked her office door and walked through the empty museum galleries, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, but her mind remained fixed on that image of the Garrett family, standing beneath their doorway with its ominous decoration. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, the digital scan of the photograph displayed on the screen, and began the research process that had become second nature to her over years of curatorial work. She started with census records, searching for the Garrett family in the 1890 and 1900 federal censuses for North Carolina. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed by fire, but she found the family listed in the 1880 census, living in Transylvania County with ages that matched the inscription on the photograph. Thomas Garrett was listed as a farmer with real estate valued at $300, a modest sum that suggested the family lived at subsistence level like most of their neighbors. The 1900 census proved more interesting and more troubling, as it showed Elizabeth Garrett living alone in the same location, now listed as a widow with no children present in the household. Sarah made careful notes, documenting the census information and creating a timeline of the family's history. She expanded her search to include newspaper archives, using digital databases that had made historical research far easier than it had been even a decade earlier. She searched for any mention of the Garrett name in newspapers published in western North Carolina between 1891 and 1900, focusing particularly on the years immediately following the date of the photograph. For more than an hour, she found nothing relevant, just scattered mentions of various Garretts involved in mundane activities like property sales and court proceedings. But then, as she was about to give up for the night, she found a brief article from the Asheville Citizen dated October 15, 1891, just weeks after. The photograph had been taken. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Mountain Family," and the article described how 3 members of the Garrett family had died under circumstances that the newspaper characterized as suspicious and disturbing, though it provided few specific details about what had actually occurred. Sarah read and reread the newspaper article, her coffee growing cold beside her laptop as she tried to extract every possible piece of information from the sparse text. The article stated that Thomas Garrett and 2 of his sons, James and Samuel, had been found dead on their property on the morning of October 12, 1891, and that local authorities were investigating the deaths. The newspaper noted that the family had been well known in the community and that the tragedy had shocked their neighbors, but it offered no explanation for what had happened or how the 3 men had died. The article concluded with a brief statement that funeral services would be held at the local Methodist church and that the surviving family members were being cared for by relatives. Sarah noted the date carefully, realizing that barely 3 weeks had passed between the taking of the family portrait and the deaths of the father and 2 oldest sons, a coincidence that seemed too significant to ignore. She continued searching through newspaper archives, looking for follow-up articles that might provide more details about the deaths or their investigation. She found a second article published a week later that added some additional information, though it raised as many questions as it answered. This article reported that the deaths had been ruled as murder and suicide by the county coroner, with the conclusion that Thomas Garrett had killed his 2 sons before taking his own life. The article noted that all 3 had died from hanging, their bodies discovered by Elizabeth Garrett when she returned to the cabin after spending the night with a sick neighbor. The newspaper quoted the sheriff as saying that Thomas Garrett had been suffering from melancholia and financial difficulties, and that he had apparently decided to end his own life and take his sons with him rather than face continued hardship. The article mentioned that the community was rallying to support the surviving widow and her 4 remaining children, and that a fund had been established to help them through the difficult winter ahead. Sarah sat back from her computer, her mind struggling to process what she had learned. The noose in the photograph suddenly took on a horrific new meaning, transforming from a mysterious curiosity into what appeared to be evidence of premeditation. Had Thomas Garrett already been planning the murders when the family portrait was taken? Was the noose hanging above the door a silent declaration of his intentions, visible to anyone who looked closely, but unrecognized by his family or the photographer? The idea seemed almost too terrible to contemplate, yet Sarah could not dismiss it. She thought about Elizabeth Garrett standing in that photograph beside her husband, unaware that within weeks she would lose him, and 2 of her sons in the most violent and traumatic way imaginable. She thought about the children, particularly James and Samuel, who had posed for the camera with no knowledge that they were living their final days. But even as Sarah constructed this narrative in her mind, she felt troubled by aspects of it that did not quite fit. The newspaper articles had been brief and somewhat vague, offering the official conclusion without much supporting detail or investigation. She knew from her historical research that newspapers of that era often accepted official explanations without much scrutiny, particularly when dealing with events in remote rural areas where reporters rarely traveled. She also knew that the late 19th century had been a time of significant social upheaval in the Appalachian region, with conflicts over land rights, timber rights, and economic development, creating tensions that sometimes erupted into violence. The phrase "before the trouble came" kept echoing in her mind, suggesting that perhaps there was more to the story than a simple case of murder and suicide driven by melancholia and poverty. Sarah made the decision to pursue the investigation further, recognizing that she had stumbled onto something that went beyond routine curatorial work. The photograph and its story had the potential to become a significant addition to the museum's collection, but more than that, Sarah felt a personal obligation to understand what had really happened to the Garrett family. She had spent her career giving voice to people whose stories had been forgotten or overlooked, and she sensed that the official narrative of the Garrett tragedy might be concealing a more complex and perhaps more troubling truth. She began making a list of research tasks for the following day. Search for court records related to the deaths, look for property records that might reveal information about the family's financial situation, try to locate descendants of the Garrett family who might have preserved family stories or documents, and reach out to colleagues at other institutions who specialized in Appalachian history and might be able to provide additional context or resources. The following morning, Sarah arrived at the museum early, before the other staff members, and went directly to her office to continue her research. She had barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and questions about the Garrett family, and she felt driven by an urgency that surprised her with its intensity. She began by searching through the museum's own archives, looking for any materials related to Pisgah Forest or the surrounding area during the 1890s. The museum held extensive collections of documents related to the timber industry that had transformed the region during that period, and Sarah knew that many mountain families had been caught up in conflicts between local residents and outside timber companies that were buying up land and cutting down the ancient forests. She pulled several boxes of materials and began working through them systematically, looking for any mention of the Garrett name or the specific area where the family had lived. After 2 hours of searching, Sarah found a reference that made her pulse quicken. Among a collection of letters written by a timber company agent named Harrison Webb, she discovered a document dated August 1891, just 1 month before the Garrett family portrait was taken. The letter was addressed to Webb's supervisor in Pennsylvania and discussed the company's efforts to acquire land in the Pisgah Forest region. Webb wrote that most local families had been willing to sell their properties for reasonable prices, but that a few holdouts were refusing to negotiate and were encouraging their neighbors to resist as well. He specifically mentioned Thomas Garrett as one of the most stubborn opponents of the timber company's expansion, describing him as a troublemaker who was spreading lies about the company's intentions and organizing meetings where local farmers discussed ways to prevent the land sales. Webb's letter concluded with a suggestion that the company might need to take more aggressive measures to overcome the resistance, though he did not specify what those measures might entail. Sarah photographed the letter with her phone and continued searching through the collection, finding several more documents that referenced the conflict between the timber company and local residents. She discovered that the situation had escalated throughout the summer and fall of 1891, with reports of threats, intimidation, and even violence directed at families who refused to sell their land. One letter described how several barns had been burned under suspicious circumstances, and another mentioned that local men who opposed the timber company had received anonymous warnings that they would face consequences if they continued their resistance. Sarah began to see the outline of an alternative narrative, one in which Thomas Garrett had not been a melancholic father, driven to murder and suicide by poverty and despair, but rather a victim of the brutal economic forces that were reshaping the Appalachian region during that period. She decided to visit the county courthouse in Brevard, the seat of Transylvania County, where she hoped to find more detailed records about the investigation into the Garrett deaths. The drive took nearly an hour through winding mountain roads that offered spectacular views of autumn foliage, but Sarah barely noticed the scenery. Her mind focused entirely on the questions she hoped to answer. At the courthouse, she explained her research to a helpful clerk who directed her to the archives room where historical records were stored. She requested all documents related to the Garrett case from 1891, and after a wait of about 30 minutes, the clerk returned with a thin folder containing a coroner's report, a brief sheriff's investigation summary, and several witness statements. Sarah settled at a table in the corner of the archives room and began reading through the materials with intense concentration. The coroner's report was brief and clinical, stating that Thomas Garrett, age 47, and his sons James Garrett, age 19, and Samuel Garrett, age 15, had died by hanging on or about October 11, 1891. The report noted that all 3 bodies had been found suspended from ropes attached to a beam in the cabin, and that the physical evidence was consistent with death by asphyxiation. The coroner had concluded that Thomas Garrett had first hanged his 2 sons while they slept, or were otherwise incapacitated, and had then hanged himself, though the report did not explain how the coroner had reached this conclusion or what specific evidence supported it. Sarah noted that the report made no mention of any investigation into alternative explanations, and that it had been completed and filed within just 2 days of the discovery of the bodies, an unusually quick resolution for such a serious case. She turned to the witness statements, hoping to find more detailed information about what Elizabeth Garrett and others had observed. The witness statements proved far more revealing than the official reports, offering glimpses into the events surrounding the deaths that complicated the simple narrative of murder and suicide. Elizabeth Garrett's statement, taken on October 13, 1891, described how she had spent the night of October 11th at the home of her neighbor, Sarah Patterson, who had been ill with fever and needed assistance. Elizabeth stated that when she left her cabin that evening, her husband and sons had been in good spirits, discussing plans for the harvest and showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. She had returned home the following morning to find the cabin door standing open and her husband and two oldest sons dead inside, their bodies hanging from a beam that ran across the main room. Elizabeth's statement emphasized that her husband had never shown any signs of melancholia or spoken of harming himself or his children, and she expressed bewilderment at the official conclusion that he had committed the murders. She stated that Thomas had been worried about pressure from the timber company to sell their land, and that he had received threatening visits from men associated with the company, but she insisted that these concerns had not driven him to despair. Sarah read through statements from several neighbors who had known the Garrett family, and their accounts consistently contradicted the official narrative. Multiple witnesses described Thomas Garrett as a devoted father and a respected member of the community who had been actively organizing resistance to the timber company's land acquisition efforts. One neighbor, a man named Jacob Morrison, stated that he had attended a meeting at the Garrett cabin just 3 days before the deaths, where Thomas had urged local farmers to stand firm against pressure to sell their properties. Morrison stated that Thomas had seemed determined and hopeful rather than despondent, and that he had spoken about the importance of preserving their land for future generations. Another witness, a woman named Martha Collins, stated that she had seen strange men lurking near the Garrett property in the days before the deaths, men she did not recognize as local residents, and that she had warned Elizabeth to be careful. The sheriff's investigation summary was perhaps the most troubling document in the file, as it revealed how little actual investigation had been conducted before the case was closed. The sheriff, a man named William Dockery, had written a brief report stating that he had examined the scene, interviewed Elizabeth Garrett and a few neighbors, and concluded that the evidence supported the coroner's finding of murder and suicide. But Sarah noticed that the report made no mention of investigating the threatening visits that Elizabeth had described, no mention of identifying or questioning the strange men that Martha Collins had seen, and no mention of considering whether the timber company might have been involved in the deaths. The report seemed designed to reach a predetermined conclusion rather than to uncover the truth, and Sarah began to suspect that Sheriff Dockery might have had reasons for wanting the case closed quickly without deeper scrutiny. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon in the courthouse archives, searching through property records and court documents that might shed additional light on the situation. She discovered that in the months following the Garrett deaths, Elizabeth Garrett had sold the family's land to the timber company for a price that seemed remarkably low given the property's size and timber value. The sale had been completed in December 1891, just 2 months after the tragedy, and the deed included a notation that the sale was made under duress due to the widow's financial circumstances. Sarah also found records showing that several other families in the same area had sold their properties to the timber company during the same period, and that the wave of sales had effectively ended local resistance to the company's expansion. The pattern suggested a coordinated campaign of intimidation and violence designed to break the will of families who refused to cooperate. As Sarah drove back to Asheville that evening, she felt a mixture of anger and sadness about what she had uncovered. The official story of the Garrett tragedy had been a lie, or at least a gross oversimplification that concealed the real forces at work. Thomas Garrett had not been a desperate man driven to murder his children and himself, but rather a victim of the brutal economic exploitation that had characterized the industrialization of Appalachia. The noose hanging above the family's door in the photograph now seemed less like evidence of premeditation and more like a symbol of the threats that the family faced, perhaps even a warning that had been placed there by the timber company's agents to intimidate Thomas into compliance. Sarah realized that she had a responsibility to tell this story, to correct the historical record and give the Garrett family the justice they had been denied more than a century earlier. But she also knew that making such claims would require more evidence than she currently possessed, and that she would face resistance from people who preferred comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. Sarah spent the next several weeks pursuing every possible lead that might help her build a more complete picture of what had happened to the Garrett family. She reached out to colleagues at universities and historical societies across the region, asking if anyone had information about timber company violence in western North Carolina During the 1890s, several historians responded with references to similar incidents in other mountain communities where families who resisted land sales had faced intimidation, property destruction, and in some cases physical violence. One professor at Appalachian State University sent her a collection of oral histories that had been recorded in the 1930s as part of a federal writers' project, and among those interviews, Sarah found testimony from elderly residents who remembered the timber wars of the 1890s and described them as a reign of terror that had driven many families from their ancestral lands. These accounts provided important context for understanding the Garrett case, but they did not offer direct evidence about what had happened on that October night in 1891. Sarah also attempted to locate living descendants of the Garrett family, hoping that family stories or documents might have been preserved across the generations. She started with genealogical databases and worked forward from the 1900 census, tracing the lives of the 4 Garrett children who had survived the tragedy. She discovered that Mary Garrett had married a man named John Patterson in 1895 and had moved to Tennessee, where she raised 6 children and lived until her death in 1954. Robert and William Garrett had both remained in North Carolina, working as farmers and raising families of their own, though both had moved away from the Pisgah forest area and never returned to the land where their father and brothers had died. Elizabeth Garrett had lived with various family members until her death in 1908, never remarrying and reportedly never speaking publicly about the events of October 1891. Sarah managed to identify several great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of the Garrett siblings, and she began reaching out to them through letters and phone calls, explaining her research and asking if they had any family materials or stories that might be relevant. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Sarah received a phone call from a woman named Patricia Garrett Thompson, who identified herself as the great-great-granddaughter of Robert Garrett. Patricia explained that her grandmother had passed away the previous year and that, while cleaning out her grandmother's house, Patricia had discovered a trunk in the attic containing old family papers and photographs. Among these materials was a diary that had belonged to Mary Garrett Patterson, the daughter who had survived the 1891 tragedy and moved to Tennessee. Patricia said that she had only glanced through the diary but had noticed that it contained entries from the 1890s that mentioned her family's time in North Carolina. She offered to send the diary to Sarah for examination, and Sarah eagerly accepted, providing her address and promising to take excellent care of the document. When the package arrived a week later, Sarah opened it with trembling hands, sensing that she might be about to discover the truth that had eluded her for weeks. Mary Garrett's diary was a small leather-bound book with pages yellowed by age and filled with neat handwriting in faded ink. The entries began in January 1890, when Mary was 15 years old, and continued through 1895, covering the period of the family tragedy and its aftermath. Sarah read through the diary carefully, taking notes and photographing key pages, and what she found there confirmed her suspicions about what had really happened. Mary's entries from the summer and fall of 1891 described the increasing pressure that her family faced from the timber company and its agents. She wrote about men who came to the cabin making threats, about neighbors who sold their land after their barns were burned, about her father's determination to resist despite the danger. In an entry dated September 20th, 1891, just days after the family portrait was taken, Mary wrote about the noose that had appeared above their door one morning, left there as a warning by men her father believed worked for the timber company. Thomas Garrett had refused to take it down, Mary wrote, saying that he would not be intimidated and that the noose would remain as evidence of the threats they faced. The diary entries from October 1891 were the most devastating to read, as Mary described the night of the tragedy and its aftermath in heartbreaking detail. She wrote that on the evening of October 11th, her mother had gone to help a sick neighbor, and that she and her younger brothers had been sent to stay with relatives who lived several miles away, a precaution her father had insisted upon because he feared something might happen. Mary wrote that her father and older brothers had planned to stay awake that night, expecting that the timber company men might come, and that they had prepared to defend their home if necessary. The next morning, Mary and her younger brothers had been brought back to the cabin by their uncle, who had received word that something terrible had happened. Mary's description of finding her father and brothers dead was almost unbearable to read, her grief and confusion pouring out in words that had been written more than a century ago, but still carried the weight of fresh trauma. She wrote that the scene looked wrong, that the positions of the bodies seemed strange, and that she heard her uncle and other men whispering about murder rather than suicide, though the official investigation quickly silenced such talk. Armed with Mary Garrett's diary and the other evidence she had accumulated, Sarah began preparing a comprehensive report that would document the true story of the Garrett family tragedy. She knew that what she was about to present would challenge the accepted historical narrative and potentially create controversy, but she felt obligated to pursue the truth regardless of the consequences. She spent long hours in her office, organizing her research materials and crafting a narrative that was both scholarly, rigorous, and emotionally compelling. The report detailed the economic context of the timber wars in Appalachia, the specific threats and intimidation that the Garrett family had faced, the inadequacies of the official investigation, and the evidence suggesting that Thomas Garrett and his sons had been murdered by agents of the timber company rather than dying in a murder-suicide, as the authorities had claimed. Sarah included photographs of key documents, transcriptions of relevant passages from Mary's diary, and analysis that connected the Garrett case to broader patterns of violence and exploitation during that period. Sarah presented her findings first to the museum's board of directors, a group of local business leaders and history enthusiasts who oversaw the institution's operations and major decisions. She had prepared a presentation that walked through her research process and conclusions, and she distributed copies of her written report for the board members to review. The presentation lasted nearly an hour, and when Sarah finished, the room fell silent as board members absorbed what they had heard. The first response came from Richard Caldwell, a retired banker who had served on the board for more than 20 years, and his reaction was not what Sarah had hoped for. Caldwell expressed concern that the museum was venturing into controversial territory by challenging official, historical records and making accusations against a timber company that, while long defunct, had been an important part of the region's economic development. He suggested that the museum should focus on presenting facts rather than interpretations, and that Sarah's conclusions went beyond what the evidence could definitively support. Other board members joined the discussion, and Sarah found herself defending her research against skepticism and resistance. Some board members worried about potential legal implications of accusing the timber company of murder, even though the events had occurred more than a century ago, and all the individuals involved were long dead. Others expressed concern that the story was too dark and disturbing for the museum's family-friendly image, and that visitors would be uncomfortable confronting such violence and injustice. A few board members supported Sarah's work and argued that the museum had a responsibility to tell difficult truths about the past, but they were outnumbered by those who preferred a more cautious approach. After 2 hours of debate, the board reached a compromise decision that left Sarah frustrated and disappointed. They agreed that the Garrett family photograph could be included in the upcoming exhibition, but that the interpretive text accompanying it would present both the official narrative and Sarah's alternative interpretation, without definitively endorsing either version. The board also decided that Mary Garrett's diary and the other supporting documents would not be displayed, though they could be mentioned in the exhibition materials. Sarah left the board meeting feeling defeated and angry, believing that the board's decision represented a failure of institutional courage and a betrayal of the Garrett family's memory. She understood the board's concerns about controversy and legal liability, but she believed that those concerns should not override the museum's fundamental obligation to historical truth. Over the following days, Sarah wrestled with the question of what to do next. She could accept the board's compromise and present a watered-down version of her research, or she could take her findings public through other channels and risk damaging her relationship with the museum that had been her professional home for 15 years. She consulted with colleagues at other institutions, and several of them encouraged her to publish her research in an academic journal where it would receive peer review and reach a scholarly audience. Others suggested that she contact journalists who might be interested in writing about the case and bringing it to public attention. Sarah ultimately decided to pursue multiple strategies simultaneously, believing that the story deserved the widest possible audience. She submitted an article to the Journal of Appalachian Studies, a respected academic publication that focused on the history and culture of the mountain region. She also reached out to a journalist named Michael Chen, who worked for a regional magazine and had written extensively about Appalachian history and social justice issues. Chen was immediately interested in the story and agreed to visit Asheville to interview Sarah and examine her research materials. When they met at a coffee shop near the museum, Sarah spread out copies of documents and photographs on the table between them, and she walked Chen through the evidence and her conclusions. Chen asked probing questions and took extensive notes, and by the end of their 2-hour conversation, he was convinced that Sarah had uncovered a significant historical injustice that deserved public attention. He promised to write a feature article about the case and to include interviews with Garrett family descendants and other experts who could provide additional context and perspective. The article appeared in the magazine 3 months later under the headline, "The Noose Above the Door: How a Family Portrait Revealed a Century-Old Murder," and its impact exceeded anything Sarah had anticipated. Chen had crafted a compelling narrative that combined Sarah's research with interviews from Patricia Garrett Thompson and other family descendants, as well as commentary from historians who specialized in Appalachian studies and the history of industrial violence. The article included high-resolution images of the Garrett family photograph with the noose clearly visible above the door, and it presented a devastating critique of the official investigation that had covered up the truth about the family's deaths. Within days of publication, the article had been shared thousands of times on social media, and Sarah began receiving emails and phone calls from people across the country who were moved by the story and wanted to know more. Several major newspapers picked up the story and published their own articles, and Sarah found herself giving interviews to radio programs and podcasts that wanted to discuss the case and its implications. The publicity brought renewed attention to the museum's upcoming exhibition, and the board of directors found themselves facing pressure from the public and the media to present Sarah's research more prominently. Community members organized a petition demanding that the museum tell the full story of the Garrett family tragedy, and local civil rights organizations issued statements supporting Sarah's work and calling for historical accountability. The board held an emergency meeting to reconsider their earlier decision, and this time the discussion was very different. Board members who had previously expressed caution now acknowledged that the public interest in the case made it impossible to present a watered-down version of the story, and that the museum's credibility would be damaged if it appeared to be suppressing important historical findings. After lengthy deliberation, the board voted to expand the Garrett family display and to include Mary's diary and other supporting documents that Sarah had uncovered. They also agreed to organize a public symposium where historians and community members could discuss the case and its broader significance. The exhibition opened in November to crowds that far exceeded the museum's usual attendance, with visitors lining up outside the building, waiting for their chance to see the Garrett family photograph and learn about the tragedy that had befallen them. Sarah had worked with the museum's exhibition designer to create a display that presented the story in a thoughtful and respectful manner, with the photograph as the centerpiece surrounded by documents, maps, and interpretive panels that explained the historical context and the evidence supporting her conclusions. The display included a reproduction of key pages from Mary Garrett's diary, allowing visitors to read her own words describing the threats her family faced and the aftermath of the tragedy. There was also a section devoted to the broader history of timber company violence in Appalachia, showing that the Garrett case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation and abuse that had affected countless families during that period. The public symposium took place on a Saturday afternoon in the museum's auditorium, and more than 200 people attended to hear presentations from Sarah and other scholars who had studied similar cases. Sarah presented her research in detail, walking the audience through the evidence and explaining how she had pieced together the true story of what happened to the Garrett family. Other speakers discussed the economic forces that had driven the timber industry's expansion into Appalachia, the legal and political structures that had enabled companies to operate with impunity, and the long-term consequences of that exploitation for mountain communities. Several descendants of the Garrett family attended the symposium, including Patricia Garrett Thompson, who spoke movingly about what it meant to finally know the truth about her ancestors and to see their story told with honesty and respect. The symposium concluded with a discussion about the importance of revisiting historical narratives and correcting injustices, even when those injustices occurred long ago and the perpetrators are beyond the reach of legal accountability. In the weeks following the symposium, Sarah received word that her article had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Appalachian Studies, and that it would appear in the next issue, along with commentary from other scholars in the field. She also learned that several universities were incorporating her research into their courses on Appalachian history, and that the Garrett case was being used as an example of how careful archival research and critical analysis could challenge accepted historical narratives. The museum reported that attendance had increased significantly since the exhibition opened, and that visitors were spending more time in the galleries and engaging more deeply with the materials on display. The board of directors, which had initially been reluctant to embrace Sarah's research, now recognized that the Garrett family story had become one of the museum's most important and impactful exhibitions, and they began discussing plans to develop additional displays that would explore other overlooked or suppressed aspects of regional history. As winter settled over the mountains and the initial wave of publicity about the Garrett case began to subside, Sarah found herself reflecting on what the experience had taught her about the nature of historical truth and the responsibilities of those who work to preserve and interpret the past. She had always believed that history was not simply a collection of facts and dates, but rather an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, a process of asking questions and seeking answers that could help people understand how they had arrived at their current circumstances. The Garrett case had reinforced that belief, while also revealing how difficult and contentious that process could be, particularly when historical truths challenged powerful interests or comfortable assumptions. Sarah realized that her work on the case had changed her in fundamental ways, making her more willing to ask difficult questions and more determined to pursue answers even when doing so created conflict or controversy. The impact of Sarah's research extended beyond the museum and the academic world, reaching into the lives of the Garrett family descendants who had lived for generations with an incomplete and inaccurate understanding of their family history. Patricia Garrett Thompson organized a family reunion that brought together dozens of descendants from across the country, many of whom had never met before and had not known about their connection to the 1891 tragedy. The reunion took place in the spring at a community center near the site where the Garrett cabin had once stood, and Sarah was invited to attend and present her research to the assembled family members. She brought copies of documents and photographs, including the family portrait with the noose above the door, and she spent hours answering questions and listening to family members share their own stories and memories. Many of the descendants expressed gratitude for Sarah's work, saying that it had given them a sense of closure and allowed them to honor their ancestors properly for the first time. The reunion concluded with a ceremony at the site of the old Garrett homestead, which was now part of the Pisgah National Forest and accessible only by hiking trail. The family members walked together through the forest, following a path that wound through towering trees that had grown up in the decades since the timber company had cut down the original old-growth forest. When they reached the site, marked by a few remaining foundation stones and a depression in the ground where the cabin's root cellar had been, they formed a circle and took turns speaking about what the Garrett family meant to them and what they hoped would be remembered about Thomas, Elizabeth, James, Samuel, and the other family members who had lived and died there. Patricia read passages from Mary Garrett's diary, her voice breaking with emotion as she shared her great-great-grandmother's words with the assembled relatives. Someone had brought a wooden cross that they planted in the ground as a memorial, and several family members left flowers and other tokens of remembrance. Sarah stood at the edge of the circle, feeling honored to be included in this intimate family moment and moved by the power of historical truth to heal wounds that had persisted across generations. She thought about the photograph that had started her on this journey, that image of 7 people standing in front of their cabin with a noose hanging ominously above their door. She understood now that the noose had not been a symbol of Thomas Garrett's intentions, but rather a symbol of the threats and violence that powerful interest had used to crush resistance and seize land from families who had lived on it for generations. The photograph had preserved that truth even when official records had obscured it, waiting more than a century for someone to look closely enough to see what it revealed. Sarah felt grateful that she had been the one to notice that detail and to pursue the questions it raised, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose about her work as a curator and historian. In the months that followed, Sarah continued to research other aspects of Appalachian history that had been overlooked or misrepresented in official narratives. She discovered several other cases similar to the Garrett tragedy, instances where families had faced violence and intimidation from timber companies or other industrial interests, and where official investigations had failed to pursue justice or had actively covered up the truth. She began developing plans for a larger exhibition that would explore the timber wars of the 1890s more comprehensively, showing how the industrialization of Appalachia had transformed the region and displaced countless families from their ancestral lands. The museum's board, now fully supportive of Sarah's work, approved funding for the project and agreed to dedicate a permanent gallery space to exploring difficult and controversial aspects of regional history. Sarah also began mentoring younger historians and curators who were interested in pursuing similar research, sharing the methods and approaches she had developed while investigating the Garrett case. The legacy of Sarah's research on the Garrett family extended far beyond the walls of the Appalachian Heritage Museum, influencing how historians and the public thought about the process of uncovering and confronting difficult truths about the past. Other museums and historical societies across the region began re-examining their own collections and narratives, looking for stories that had been suppressed or misrepresented, and working to present more complete and honest accounts of regional history. Several institutions reached out to Sarah for advice and collaboration, and she found herself part of a growing network of scholars and curators who were committed to challenging sanitized versions of history and giving voice to people whose experiences had been marginalized or erased. The work was not always popular or easy, as it often meant confronting powerful myths and comfortable assumptions that people preferred not to question, but Sarah believed it was essential if history was to serve its proper function of helping people understand themselves and their world. The Garrett family photograph remained on permanent display at the museum, its image reproduced in textbooks and articles about Appalachian history and the methods of historical research. Students and scholars who visited the museum often spent long minutes studying the photograph, examining the faces of the family members and the ominous noose hanging above their door, trying to imagine what those people had experienced and what they had known about their fate. The photograph had become an icon of sorts, a reminder that historical documents often contain hidden meanings and suppressed truths that require careful attention and critical analysis to uncover. Sarah sometimes stood in the gallery watching visitors engage with the photograph, and she felt satisfaction knowing that the Garrett family's story was finally being told with honesty and respect, that their suffering had not been forgotten or dismissed, and that their resistance to injustice was being recognized and honored. Years after her initial discovery of the photograph, Sarah received an unexpected letter from a lawyer representing the descendants of Harrison Webb, the timber company agent, whose correspondence Sarah had found during her research. The letter informed Sarah that Webb's descendants had discovered additional documents in their family papers, including a detailed journal that Webb had kept during his time working in western North Carolina. The descendants, troubled by what they had read in the journal, wanted to donate it to the museum so that it could be made available to researchers and the public. Sarah met with the descendants and accepted the journal, and when she read through it, she found confirmation of what she had long suspected. Webb's journal contained entries describing the campaign of intimidation and violence that the timber company had orchestrated against families who refused to sell their land, and it specifically mentioned the Garrett family and the decision to make an example of them to discourage further resistance. The journal stopped short of explicitly admitting to murder, but it made clear that Webb and his associates had been responsible for creating the circumstances that led to the deaths of Thomas Garrett and his sons. The discovery of Webb's journal provided the final piece of evidence that Sarah had been seeking, definitively proving that the Garrett tragedy had been murder rather than suicide, and that the official investigation had either been incompetent or complicit in covering up the truth. Sarah published a follow-up article presenting the new evidence, and the museum updated its exhibition to include relevant passages from the journal. The revelation generated another wave of media attention and public discussion, and it prompted calls for some form of official recognition or apology for the injustice that had been done to the Garrett family. While no formal apology was forthcoming from government authorities, the State Historical Commission did agree to install a marker at the site of the Garrett homestead, acknowledging what had happened there and honoring the family's memory. The marker was unveiled at a ceremony attended by Garrett descendants, local officials, and members of the public, and it stands today as a testament to the power of historical research to recover lost truths and provide a measure of justice even across the span of more than a century. Sarah continued her work at the museum for many more years, always guided by the lessons she had learned from the Garrett case about the importance of looking closely at historical evidence, asking difficult questions, and refusing to accept convenient narratives that obscured uncomfortable truths. She trained a new generation of curators and historians who carried forward her commitment to honest and inclusive history, and she took satisfaction in knowing that her work had made a difference not just in academic circles, but in the lives of real people who had been affected by historical injustices. When she finally retired, the museum organized a symposium in her honor, and speakers from across the country came to celebrate her contributions to Appalachian history and historical methodology. Patricia Garrett Thompson attended the symposium and presented Sarah with a gift on behalf of the Garrett family descendants, a framed reproduction of the 1891 family photograph with an inscription thanking Sarah for giving voice to their ancestors and ensuring that their story would never be forgotten. Sarah hung the photograph in her home office, where it remained a constant reminder of why historical work mattered and what could be accomplished when someone cared enough to look beyond the surface and seek the truth that lay hidden beneath.